Hey, what's up, guys? It's Steve here from the Fandom show. Hope your week is going well so far. No Monday sucked this week because Monday was a holiday, so I decided to skip it, but we'll be back with more of that next week. In the meantime, you can go back and check out all the previous episodes if there are any you missed. Today, I want to do something a little bit different. I basically want to go back to the very beginning of fandoms, if you will. All the fandoms that we love and that we're obsessed with are all based around all kinds of wonderful stories, whether they be fantasy stories or superhero stories or action stories or horror stories or just about anything and everything. But long before we had any of these fandoms, we had all different kinds of traditional stories and, of course, fairy tales and all that kind of thing. So I want to show you this book. This is called An Illustrated Treasury of Fairy and Folk Tales. Now, this particular book is over 30 years old. It was originally published in 1986, and this copy belonged to my grandparents. It was part of a two-book set. I have the other book on my bookcase right over here, and it's just a massive collection of fairy tales and folk tales, like it said. But the first thing that I want to do is I want to read the introduction to you because I think it really drives down to what I'm talking about here. So here we go. I once met a man up in the Arctic who told me what folk tales meant to him. There were some half-dozen grown people squatting in the half-dark of a walrus tent, washing down whale innards with some potent brew and swapping folk yarns. This man, a wizened old nut-brown barrel of a fellow, was saying that when he was a lad, no one for hundreds of miles could read or write. There were no schools, no radio, no television, no papers or books, no churches or clubs. But there were folk tales. When the young people came home to their snug tents from a rough day on the ice, they enjoyed the happiest times of their short lives, the treasured hour of storytelling. Old Gran or Granddad would sit closer to the fire, pull a dogskin rug around them and begin a story, the old man told me. And those tales taught me to understand life and to be brave and to fight evil. They lifted the tent flap on a brighter morrow, free from want and sorrow. And now when I recall my cold and hungry childhood, I wonder what life would have been without those wonderful stories so full of hope. That's really cool, isn't it? The printing press was first introduced back in the 1400s, so it's been around for about 600 years now. Prior to that, the only way we had for stories to be passed along are either verbally, orally, as it was done for generations, and in fact it's still done that way in many cultures around the world today. Prior to the printing press, there were, of course, written books, but they couldn't manufacture copies. So if they wanted to copy a book, they had to hand make a copy, which means they had to write out the entire book for however many copies they want to make. It was very painstaking work. The printing press solved that problem by allowing people to mass produce books. So again, printing press was introduced in the 1400s, which is 600 years ago, centuries before we had movies, television, radio, YouTube, comic books, and any of the stuff that we have today. So really, books were the first medium where we started to share stories. And of course, many of those popular stories were from fairy tales and folklore. I'm sure many of us have many fond memories of hearing fairy tales when we grew up. It's interesting that the introduction to this book mentions a grandfather sitting around telling his kids stories. You might have heard me say that this book originally belonged to my grandparents. I have many warm memories of my grandfather reading these stories to me and my brother before we went to bed. So that's a very powerful memory for me and one of those moments from my childhood that I do well and truly treasure. So I want to show you something here. There's some wonderful artwork in this book too, by the way. This is the page for the beginning of the Pinocchio story. I think you can see that pretty well, at least I hope you can. The art style is a little bit different, but it is kind of old-timey, and it does fit the subject material of the book. Another thing you can tell, so this book is awfully thick. It's about the size of a large textbook. So there are a lot of stories in here. I'm not sure of the actual number, but I wanted to read some of the titles. Now, of course, there are some all-time favorites in here, like Pinocchio, Jack and the Beanstalk, Rapunzel. There's a few others in here, too. What was the other one that was really well known that I came... Oh, Sleeping Beauty. And a few others, but there's also some you might not have heard of. There's some very unique stories in here, so let me read you a few titles you might not have heard of. 6 Blind Men and an Elephant, Children of the Wind, Kotura, Lord of the Winds, The Man Who Sold Words, The Rainbow and the Breadfruit Flower, The Beauty of Life, 5 Monstrous Creatures, and my personal favorite, The King of the Cats. I haven't read all the stories in here. I probably should at some point because they're very wonderful. One thing to note is these are intended for children, so they're not going to be, there's not going to be any adult material, anything problematic in them. Now, they're not the Disney-fied version of the stories. These are the original versions of the stories, so they won't be super happy, friendly, cartoony, but they're appropriate for kids. I mean, again, there's nothing bad in them. They won't be as bright and colorful as the Disney versions. Let's just say that. But this is a very wonderful anthology. I still very much believe in the value of telling bedtime stories. I mean, even if you're reading it off an iPad or whatever, the idea is that you tell a story and you plant the seed of adventure in kids' heads. And so because of these folk tales and fairy tales that we have, these are the stories that gave us all of the wonderful superhero stories and, action movies, television shows, science fiction shows, all of these wonderful fandoms that we love today. All the stories, all the creativity that we see in that can be traced back to the stories that are in this book, because the stories in here really laid the foundation for what we see today. So sometimes to appreciate what's in the present, you have to go back to the past. Again, if you don't have an anthology like this, I would definitely recommend picking it up. You don't necessarily need this one, but I just think it's nice to have a physical book of fairy tales that you can read, because that's something that I think, even to this day, is a good thing for children to be exposed to. So hopefully there are parents and grandparents out there who still crack these books open and read these wonderful stories to their kids and get those imaginations going. Hey, they'll be the creators of tomorrow. So who knows? There's probably a kid out there who's going to hear a story tonight that might plant that seed, and maybe he'll create the next great superhero. That's what's wonderful about stories. They can take us anywhere we want to go. That's all for tonight. I do hope you enjoyed watching, and I will be back later with more fun stuff.